Good evening, everyone. My name is Tim Calabrese. I'm chair of the Planning Commission, and really glad we had a good turnout here. And tonight we're going to talk about our proposed draft subdivision regulations. First off, I'd like the Planning Commission, everybody to introduce themselves.
So I'm not on the Town Planning Commission. My name is Jason Rasmussen. I'm with Mount Ascutney Regional Commission. I've been helping them out on this project.
Who's not going to be a member of the Planning Commission?
Miguel Seville.
Shirley Clark. Shannon Devereaux, liaison from the select.
Okay, great. So I know a lot of you are asking, why are we proposing subdivision regulations? How did we get here? So I'll kind of give a brief synopsis. I guess about a year and a half ago, we started looking into them. We've seen sort of a moderate creeping development in town happening. And our thought was to be proactive, to develop some simple subdivision regulations to sort of guide that growth and to set some standards for development in terms of road gradients, the infrastructure, protection of sensitive areas. And what it is not zoning. It does not control what the use of your property is. For instance, it doesn't control a commercial use or anything like that. It doesn't have setbacks requirements. It basically is a document and an ordinance to foster good design and engineering and to protect surrounding neighboring properties. Because as we all know, we have all seen developments where you have issues with drainage and that can impact neighboring properties, emergency access with roads very steep that can't be negotiated by emergency vehicles, things of that nature. So the way we're gonna handle this meeting is Jason's gonna give a presentation, and then we'll have a question comment period. And if you wish to ask a question, maybe just come up to the mic here. We also have a handheld mic. And also, maybe it'd be a good idea if everybody just wants to introduce themselves. We're all neighbors.
Sorry.
Brian Key, editor. Bonnie and Ron Emmett.
Wendy Revere.
Randy Melanson.
Sam Lindsay.
Chad Devereaux.
Joe Fry. Maureen Savage.
Chris Lucky. Gary Beverly. Dave Crosby.
Rolf Van Schaik.
Sandra Russo. Margot Caulfield. Paula Felt. Eddie McEnany.
Abraham Gross.
Diane McNamara.
Rick Chambers.
Okay, well, great. I guess, Jason, you want to take it away?
Sure. So I'm going to just talk fairly briefly about some background information, kind of set the stage a little bit. If you've not grabbed one, there's two documents up here. There's one little 4-pager that sort of explains what is a subdivision fairly briefly. And the other thing is the actual draft subdivision language. So if you haven't grabbed one and you want one, please feel free.
Down to it.
Okay. Okay, so I'll jump back into this thing so we're not here all night long. I'm going to start with a really basic overview of sort of planning and zoning. And, essentially, in state law, this is sort of what the process looks like. So planning is really, so the town has a town plan. It was adopted in 2020. That's what I'm talking about when I say planning, for the most part. And that's really where what's the future of Cavendish is spelled out. And there's some level of a plan to how to achieve what that is. And that's sort of what this little circular diagram is talking about. It's sort of you plan, then you figure out how to make it happen, and then you review how's it going, and you start all over again. In very general terms, that's sort of that planning process. The plan, there's a couple ways to make things that the plan calls for happen. One is regulatory and one is non-regulatory. So there's certainly other non-regulatory things that we can do. We're working with Rick on some capital budgeting stuff right now. And that's certainly good. That's really just planning ahead what you're going to spend your town dollars on to make stuff happen. And there's other things you can do. I'm not going to dwell on those, but if there's questions, we can talk about it. And the regulatory tools, you have flood hazard regulations now. You do not have zoning, and you do not have subdivision. And we're thinking of possibly preparing subdivision that possibly could be adopted, and we're going to explain a little bit what that means. Well, I have a plan. Again, the plan is really just sort of an opportunity to talk to the community. What do we want? What's the future of Cavendish? And I think that's what the plan does now. And it really talks about the future and then how to do it. It really serves as the basis for regulations. So if we're going to do subdivision, what does the plan say about it? And does this draft achieve some of those goals that the plan is calling for? And there's some other things that the plan itself does. It helps you have village center designation. There's some benefits to that, some financial benefits to property owners. You need a plan to get that designation. And there's a few other things. It makes you eligible for some grants. So all that's good. So that's generally speaking why you have a plan. And this is your current town plan. And I'm not going to read this stuff, but when we're doing things like regulations, we always look to the plan. What's it say? What does it want to achieve? Is there a basis in the plan for subdivision? And in fact, there is. It talks about subdivision at a number of different places. And I just highlighted a couple of those. And again, I'm not going to go into that here tonight. If there's questions, we can talk about it. But essentially, it's calling for looking at the possibility of adopting subdivision. So when you're looking at regulating, how do you implement the town plan through regulations? There's all kinds of options. This table sort of gets at that. I'm not going to go into any level of detail on this stuff. Most of what you're seeing on this table is zoning stuff, zoning provisions. Again, you don't have zoning, and we're not proposing zoning at this point in time. You have flood hazard regulations right now. That's where the checkbox is. That's really where there are river corridors and flood hazard areas mapped by FEMA. There's certain standards. And we're talking about subdivision down at the bottom. The purpose of subdivision is really to control the pattern of development. Zoning is more about the uses and density and that sort of a thing. So subdivision's not getting into that detail. It's really looking at the pattern of development, how new lots are shaped, how they access roads, how infrastructure serves the lots. I might have just said this, but what is subdivision? So here's a little picture on the side of a subdivision. So when you create new lots, you're drawing out the new lot lines. You're figuring out how access happens to the adjacent road. How are you going to get power in there? How are you going to do septic or connected to the sewer system, water, that sort of thing. It is not zoning. Again, it's not talking about how to use your land, and it's not talking about the density. Like Tim said, there's no setbacks, there's no minimum lot sizes, there's none of that stuff in here. What it's really talking about, subdivision is when you divide a lot into 2 or more lots, essentially, is what we're talking about. When you create a new lot in town, that's subdivision. And so, these draft regulations would basically be looking at what's the lot layout, how are you getting access in there, How are you going to have, what's the infrastructure connections looking like, utility, those sorts of details. This is just an example of a big subdivision. This is kind of what they look like, so you have your access and your circulation road. These are the different lots. These are where the different buildings are going to go. The darker shaded stuff is open space. So in a grand scale, that's like what a bigger subdivision can look like. Those are some of the details that we would be, probably asking for in an application. If this passes, again, this is a big project and most things are a lot smaller. Most subdivisions we see these days are like 1 or 2 lots at a time, maybe 5 lots sometimes, but rarely of this size. And why? Why do we care? Sometimes you get some really weird looking lots, so part of the thought process is really to just have some logical lots that make sense, where the access roads, feed into the town roads in ways that don't wash out the road, don't cause flooding problems, those sorts of things. Some of these, I would call that a spaghetti lot. Some of these lots here, they're really long and really skinny. They just don't make any sense. So part of the subdivision process is really to make sure that there are lots that some future person's going to buy that really just make sense. There are some lots like this out there in the world that kind of look like somebody drew it with their eyes closed, and there's no access to any roads on this one. Good luck as the new owner trying to find the actual lot lines out there in the field. So we want to kind of have a rational process, in my view, I'm speaking for myself, for creating new lots. So they're not like this where, it's really problematic to know where your lot lines are. So we're here in Vermont, we have to do regulations essentially based on what's enabled under state law. This is where subdivision is enabled. And, basically we shall include those things. The second bullet, subdivision shall contain, and there's 4 bullets there. This draft has to include those sorts of details. And then it may include some other details. That's the lower section there. So, there's a lot in here. I heard somebody say it's kind of legalese, and it is. Part of it is trying to meet those requirements. It's really part of what we're tasked with doing. You need to make sure it meets the legal standard. The draft regulations, if you have not found them, they are available on the town website. You can find it through this URL here. Looks something like that page right there. You can also just go to the Town of Cavendish homepage and scroll down, and there's a section for this subdivision right there. So you can go there and pull up the subdivision regulations if you want, explore them in more detail. And of course, there's some hard copies here today. We were trying to keep it simple, believe it or not. I mean, it is 30 pages, I know, but we're trying to keep it relatively simple. So what the current draft is doing is we have minor subdivisions, which are up to 4 lots in total. And that would be, in this draft, an administrative review. So it's a relatively quick and easy process. We haven't totally figured out who would administer this. We had some discussions about if this gets adopted, who does that? The town could appoint somebody in here to do that. The town may explore an option where they have, whether it's a consultant or whether it's through the Regional Planning Commission office, somebody has to do this stuff. But generally speaking, we're trying to keep it simple. So there would be no public hearings. There would be this relatively simple administrative process for these smaller subdivisions. In this draft, the major subdivisions, we're calling them, so that's 5 or more lots, there would be a public hearing, and you'd have to go and get approval from the Planning Commission. Boundary adjustments, so that's where you're moving a lot line around, but you're not creating any new lots. That would be exempt. In some towns, they have to go through a subdivision process for that. We're keeping that exempt at this point in this draft. again, trying to keep it simple. I think for the most part, it's the bigger subdivisions that are probably of concern. But I think all of them in this draft, we're really trying to look at these standards. So that the middle section here, and then a lot of it comes down to, where's the access road? Is it going to be too steep? Do you have adequate drainage so the road's not going to wash out? Where's your power coming from? Water, septic, those sorts of details. There is also some natural resource protections, and we can talk more about that if there's questions. But that's sort of the general version of it. There are some other things that we were trying to build into it to keep it a little more palatable. So, larger lots, there would not be a full perimeter survey required. Some of those things keep the costs a little lower. There's some wide open waiver provisions. So not everything, makes sense in every situation out there. So an applicant would be able to basically ask for any kind of a waiver of standards or process that really doesn't make sense in their particular case. That being said, it's not necessarily, you may not think of this as simple, but it's relatively simple as subdivision goes in other places. Let's see. If you want more information, I can make these slides available afterwards if anybody wants. And there's some links here to other stuff, other information, if anybody is interested in that. And I think at this point, I really just want to open it up and see if the Planning Commission wanted to add anything to what I said.
I think that the process after this, what happens is, I'm not sure if you mentioned it, but it would go to a Planning Commission hearing, and then it gets sent to the Select Board for their hearing. And then I believe, do they vote on whether to send it to town vote, or is it just automatically go?
Yeah, so I didn't talk about that. I should have. So tonight's a public informational meeting. This is really just, hey, the Planning Commission's thinking about this. What do you think? Are there any questions or concerns? After tonight, I'm imagining, I don't want to speak for you all, I'm imagining they may at their next meeting talk about, okay, now what do we do after what we hear tonight? They may decide to move forward with it. So that would, the Planning Commission would have to have a public hearing. That requires a 15-day public notice. They'd have their hearing. They'd decide whether or not to send it forward to the Select Board. If they do, the Select Board would have to have their own hearing, another 15-day notice, and then the Select Board would decide to either they're going to vote to adopt it or disapprove it, or they could opt to have it go to a town meeting vote. So that's generally the process. The quickest it would happen is probably 3 months, but more than likely it would be longer than that. It takes a while to get through the processes. Anyway, if that helps, that's the general process.
Great. All right, does anybody have any questions or comments? All right, Planning Commission, anybody have any other?
No, not at this time.
Okay, anybody has any questions? Sure, Wendy.
Yeah. How is this different? I mean, it seems to me that you have to go through Act 250 for a lot of this, and yet you're saying that isn't necessary. So what is the cutoff point between having to go through Act 250 for any of this? Is it a small, under 4 or over 5, or how does the Act 250 process fit into this?
So, projects that are eligible for Act 250 would still have to go through Act 250. But, I don't know the statistic for our neck of the woods, but I've heard that roughly 2%, if I have that number right, of projects of subdivisions statewide go through Act 250. So a lot of them are too small in scale to go through Act 250. So, there's going to be some smaller ones that aren't going through Act 250. This could help to kind of address those that ordinarily would not. The bigger stuff would have to go through both the local subdivision and the Act 250.
I believe it's 5 or more lots that has to go through Act 250.
Yeah.
And then if we did have subdivision regulations, the Act 250 board they would look at those regulations and they would have to basically abide by those if we have an ordinance. Whereas if we don't, they look at the town plan.
More level of, I'll say control, I'm not sure that's the correct word, that the town has, the easier it is for the Act 250 to analyze what the town really wants.
In theory, yes.
In theory.
Right. Yes, Rolf?
Yes.
Yeah, if everybody could just come up to the mic, or we have another mic we can hand around too, if that's easier.
Thank you, Tim.
Sure.
I would be remiss if I didn't point out that any of these subdivisions, if they are going to involve the construction of residential property or any sort of other activities that require water supply or wastewater disposal, are subject to permitting process that's already in place at the state level. The other comment I would make is that in spite of all of this legalese and whatever, there's not a single word spoken about the cost of implementing this. And I think that's a very significant part of a decision-making process, particularly planning what's it going to cost and who's going to pick up the tab. So I would strongly urge you to figure out, I will pull a rough number out of the air. For each lot that you survey, you're going to be out at least $1,000 for a surveyor's expense. And that's older money, that's going back several years now, my experience. And for a water supply, that's very much up in the air. That's on probability. Sometimes it depends on hydrologists' reports. But wastewater disposal is pretty much an exact science now. It's percolation tests, soil analysis, and whatever. And the least you're going to get away with is about $500 to get on a very simple, straightforward, damn near gravel pit or sandbank type soil condition. Anything over that is going to require more money. It can run into a huge amount of money. So I would urge you to address the cost issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there any consideration about lot sizes, minimum lot size?
That would be zoning. That's not included in subdivision regulations. It has no control over lot size.
Does the town have anything in place for zoning for that, or
Nope. No, none.
somebody can put in a subdivision of 50-acre lots and a bunch of houses, and we're gonna welcome that?
Well, if it's 5 or more lots, it would go through Act 250.
Okay.
But subdivision does not control lot size. So, I mean, zoning is a whole nother issue. We did, I believe like 30 years ago, it was proposed and it was shot down spectacularly. So,
I don't think it was that long ago, because I remember.
it was in the 90s.
Well, then, so I have a question. I'm reading about the minor and the major, and I have 6 children. So if I wanted to give each of my kids a piece of my land, that would be a major revision. But if I didn't want to go through that, I could subdivide my land for, 3 of them, or maybe when each one, turned 35 or graduated college or something. And then it would only be a minor thing, just 6 times, right?
That I am not sure of. Jason, what's the time limit? I know there's a time limit. You can't just subdivide 3 lots, wait 2 years and do 2 more. So,
I'm trying to remember refresh my memory on the timeline. 15 years. Is it 15?
15 years.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Rolf.
There's a big difference.
I know, the interval, what Dave was talking about is you subdivide one time into 3 lots. And then at some point, you subdivide those subdivided lots once again. And out of 1 lot, you create 2 lots. But actually, you're creating out of 3 lots, you're creating 6 lots. Okay? No, because This proposal here holds good for 15 years.
This,
So once it's divided in 15 years, I have to wait again to divide the biggest lot that I kept for myself.
You could bring a new proposal. You would still be subject to the regulations and the force.
Gotcha.
That's my take on it.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, so I guess my first questions start with the approval process. And the initial, if I'm reading this correctly, is in writing to the Planning Commission that requires the application to be submitted, which you have to notify your abutters. You need a subdivision plat and plan, a Mylar plat. So basically you need an engineering study, property boundaries, all right. Natural and cultural features, elevations, driveways, roads, path, parking, et cetera, et cetera. Similar to Abe, I mean, we have 3 kids. They all live here in the state of Vermont. I'd like them to stay here. We have a significant parcel, and our plan always has been for this to be our legacy. Our kids can divide it up between our children and our grandchildren, have them stay here, be a part of the community. My daughter has a business here. Our kids work here in the state. I'd like to keep them here. It seems like there's a lot of expenses involved just with us deeding them a piece of property. Unless I'm reading this wrong.
Well, first, if it is a major subdivision, you've mentioned the final plat and all that stuff, that's at the very end. So in the beginning, you would do like a sketch plan, which is just a rough plan, and you would come into the planning commission and you would, get a good idea, is this gonna be okay? Do we need to modify it? So before you have to get into any real expense for a large subdivision, you would have an idea if there are any issues. If it is a large subdivision, you can use LiDAR. Eventually, you'd want to have your lots surveyed.
Well, you would need to have a lot surveyed to create the boundaries, which is fine.
Not
But-
necessarily.
Not necessarily.
You don't have to.
Okay.
You certainly recommend anyone who owns a piece of property that they have it surveyed.
Yeah, you're not just gonna draw on a map, you gotta have it surveyed, that's just ridiculous
Right.
not to.
Right, but you have, there's open source information for like boundary lines. If you're doing a big subdivision, initially, you don't have to have everything surveyed. You can start with a sketch plan using the open source materials of the Vermont Geographic Information Systems, and they have everybody's property lines, building locations on them, roads. So that takes.
If it's been surveyed.
If it's been surveyed,
Right,
correct.
right.
Yeah.
But you can get one through LiDAR,
Mm-hmm.
because we use it all the time.
So if, and I'm just speaking for our situation. My kids can't afford to build a house right now. They can't afford the additional costs with the requirements that I see listed here. What about raw land? Is that considered a subdivision? If we just deed them, say 20 acres of raw land, how does that play into this?
You'd have to subdivide it. Yes.
So what would the requirements, they don't know how big their house is gonna be, they don't know where their driveway is, they don't know, you know what I'm saying? It's like the plan's not set yet.
Yeah. But you'd have a pretty good idea at the point that you wanted to spin off a lot from your large acreage of where it would be, and you'd have, I know you have the common sense to figure out where
Right.
the driveway would go, and are power lines, either above ground or underground, going to be able to get to it affordably? I don't really see that as a problem.
Yeah, I just,
They're
you know.
going to They want to end up with a deed to their property with defined boundary lines.
But what if they don't? Can you have more than one dwelling on one property? With a septic plan through the state? Can't you have more than one dwelling on a piece of property?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you can. That's the cheapest way out.
There you go, just to keep it all in one lot.
I'm sure the will is up.
Right. I do have a question about, you're talking about access and things like that. And a couple times in the plan, it references the Cavendish driveway and highway access ordinance. So I went online to find that on our site. Does such a thing exist?
It does. It sorely needs updating, which
But it's not on the website.
it's not. Okay.
Or is that covered on the website?
I don't know if it is.
Okay.
We found another one recently that wasn't.
Okay, well, I didn't know if that covered some of the things that were, if that ordinance already exists and it covers some of the things that are already in this, you know, is it needed twice?
It's part of the whole package in terms of, there would be a little bit of redundancy if you're doing a subdivision. You'd have to do an access permit. So that talks.
My biggest purpose in trying to advance subdivision regulations is some of the terrible driveways I've seen being built around town and how they're going to cause future problems, whether it's 5 years or 20. They're too steep. They're just narrow enough that you can get a car up, but then someone wants to build a house. The question is, how are you ever going to get a concrete truck up there? Or when the time comes, hopefully never, that a fire truck or an ambulance has to get up there. Is there a place for them to turn around? Do they have to back down that long driveway? What's the grade? How about the where it approaches the town road and no doubt has to cross a culvert? What's the size of the culvert going to be so it doesn't lead to washouts like we had up on Hill Road this past July?
And that's why I asked if the driveway and the highway access ordinance covered some of that. Because I've never seen this.
I always thought you had to have a permit to do
Yeah.
it anyway.
You do.
I always went and asked.
Yeah, there's a permit.
We always did.
Yeah, so we don't need all this other jargon. Why don't the permit process for the driveway, Mr. Rick, make sure that everything's all right. Make sure that's covered, make sure
In years past, they haven't been enforced very well.
One of the reasons being is our access permit is usually, pretty much, it's limited to the access to the town road. But we don't have, on that permit has nothing about the driveway. And if you're gonna put where the drainage is gonna go, and if it's gonna all get concentrated down a ditch on the driveway, that access permit is limited right to the coming onto the town road. That's, I think these regulations address more of how the road, the driveway will be more accessible and where the drainage is for that driveway.
So a couple of meetings ago, you presented a proposal or whatever it was about Cavendish needing more housing, more affordable housing, all this. Now we're implementing more rules and regulations to make it more difficult to build here?
Well, there'd be no doubt that any housing that's going to be built in town, that's going to involve state or federal or even private funds, they're going to want this.
Well, and I thought also one of the things that were interesting was the letter that you had to get from, first the highway superintendent, which makes sense for the roads. But then the sheriff's department or the fire departments, and then I get that's for safety. But then it's asked for a letter from an official at the Cavendish School certifying that the proposed subdivision will not unduly impact the school by causing the student population to exceed the capacity of the existing facility. And in our current state, I hope that is an issue.
I think that's in there, you know, if there was like a huge subdivision that came to town, which may never happen,
Right,
That could
well,
be an issue.
in his presentation before about affordable housing, it had to be on town water and sewer and, looking, because we know that side of the street's off limits pretty much. And so that leaves this side of the street and part of the village of Cavendish. Where are we ever gonna have a plot of land that's so big that needs to be subdivided to build a housing that's going to have that issue? I guess is my
Did you
question.
mention that there was one up in the hills somewhere, there was a proposal for a big subdivision, a while back?
Oh, we've had a number of them up and down.
There have been proposals for large.
But that's not the affordable housing he's talking about, that
Two
has to be
different
in the village.
issues.
Well, we're talking about housing, in this planning commission. We're not talking about affordable housing, that could be a component of it. We're talking about housing for people that have jobs, or not necessarily low income, although it would be nice to have a mix of that. But we're not talking about affordable housing. We
Well, all these rules and regulations, it won't be affordable.
Well, it's going to be, it inevitably is going to be some sort of subsidized housing. Because it's just so expensive to build with the wages that are paid in Windsor County, Vermont. Just, what's the figures now? Coming up on $400 a square foot? Yeah, 400 for what I would call normal construction. I'm not talking about granite countertops, finished basements. It's just, now, the one thing that we're talking about the school, when Outer Limits Brewery was being built, an Act 250 hearing was called for that, for an amendment to the construction around the town green in Proctorsville. And the question was, will this lead to a parking problem in Proctorsville? And Brendan, who was a town manager at the time, said, I'd kind of like to see a parking problem in Proctorsville. In other words, activity begets activity.
That's right. Diane, I think you had your hand up first.
I heard Rolf say, looking at the cost of implementing this, because we need an enforcement or a person hired to take on this position. And then you mentioned that access permits maybe weren't being enforced lately. And I just want to say, access permits, building permits, they're not being filed, and we have no enforcement. I don't know who people think are keeping track of these things. We have no listers. I think Rick's plate is pretty full so that he can't go driving around and looking to see who's building where. So subdivision regulations or no, we need to do something and hire someone to be looking after all these things, because the town staff can't do it. That's all I want to say.
Dave?
All right, so on page 11, there's a protection of historic and cultural resources. There's a historic features, including stone walls and cellar holes, should be preserved and integrated into the subdivision design and layout. Example, driveways may follow stone walls to the extent practicable. Is that really the word you use? Yeah, practicable. The question that I have, because again, my land has stone walls that I own both sides of, and some places that stone wall is extant and clearly there, and some places it's the middle of the woods and there's nothing there.
Yep.
It seems like I'm not quite sure how to fix it, but it seems like that's a problem.
Well, that's typical old agricultural land in Windsor County, the walls that meander through the woods and then start showing lots that really don't exist. Well, they exist, but they're not in that configuration any longer. I think the last line of that was important.
What page are you referring to?
11. Methods to avoid such undue adverse impacts include but are not limited to the following: historic features, driveways may follow stone walls to the extent practical. I would never stand in the way of someone that said, in order to utilize the lot that's behind that stone wall, I'm going to have to open up that stone wall 24 feet. I would say, okay, put the stones back on the wall to the right or the left. The wall is still preserved and you have your driveway.
I appreciate that you are a very reasonable man, Bruce. I'm just concerned that when you pass a regulation, it's not always going to be interpreted by somebody with your level of reasonableness.
We could change that language. The idea is to have some sensitivity to the cultural and historical figures that are spread throughout the woods.
I absolutely do not disagree. I just, like I said, the language is not quite right.
Okay.
Yeah, tell me if I'm wrong in this. I believe that most towns in our area have either planning, subdivision, or zoning regulations.
The only two towns in our area that don't have zoning and subdivision regulations, one is Mount Holly, and the other is really not even in our area, but it's the only other one is Heartland.
So my question then, and I thought that was correct, but my question then is how does that impact people coming into our town when we have that leniency of not having any of these regulations? Would we find that there would be more development in our town because we are an easy town to develop?
Yes. I have heard people say to me, well, you can do anything you want in Cavendish. And other people refer to it as the Wild West of subdivisions.
So then the last thing is that, so in a sense, even though it will be more expensive if we go through this, it actually ends up preserving our community because it's keeping a lot of, it's enforcing some guidelines that other towns have and we don't have. Is that correct? It's sort of bringing us up to a standard that other towns in the community in this area have.
Well, I still like to think of Cavendish as a town that's based on resources, such things as logging, gravel removal, and quarrying. I think it's a traditional use of Vermont for the last 250 years. But we like to see some rules and regulations concerning it. But I would never want to say no to somebody.
I just kind of add to the conversation that I don't want this to sound bad, but yes, this does add some costs to a project, but it's going to be to build a house is like $400,000-$500,000. So what's in that extra $1,000 or $2,000 for survey? Not a lot. Is it significant? It can be, but I get it. We don't want to necessarily make things too expensive, but I think it's not a huge component of the cost of building a house. And I did also want to mention something about the driveway issue. Like Rick was saying, the town driveway permit process is sort of the driveway section within the town highway right-of-way. So the subdivision would look much beyond that. And so the steeper sections of driveway are often far beyond the town right-of-way. So it does give the town an ability to sort of look at those really steep goat path type driveways and hopefully try to prevent some of that.
I think Margot had her hand up.
Yeah, Bruce, you talk about what's happened in the last 200 years or so, but we've had people here for 10,000 years. So when looking at what Abe brought out, what happens, and I've already done enough archaeology here, and I know that because of the Black River, there was minimal permanency here. In other words, we do know there was an upland Indian village in one section of town about 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. But what do you do if you start doing this and you come up with significant feature that indicates that this was established land 5,000 years ago?
Yeah, I don't think that, unless it's an Act 250, we're not in a position to say that there has to be an archaeological site visit, including pits and things like that for personal property. Act 250, of course, they will.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah, but that's not the intention of the planning commission, to complicate someone's life by saying you have to get a professional archaeologist in here.
Well, I just think, as a historian, our history is 10,000 years. It's not 200. That's white man's history. And we have to be sensitive to this, because I get this every day. We have to understand that, and we do need to be aware of it. And I'm pretty clear where the areas were. But understand that people are going to find this stuff, and if I'm in a position that I find it, I'm bound because of the work I do. I have to report that.
Yep.
So why is it more important to preserve a stone wall, but not a farming community of early man? I'm just asking.
Farming community of what?
Our first farmers here, 5,000 years ago. We know there was an upland Indian village here.
Well, I guess it's a situation where it's show me.
Oh, I can definitely show you. You know where it is. You've seen what came out of it.
Hey, Rolf, did you have a question?
Well, excuse me for remaining seated, but I have this overriding sense, and it's growing stronger all the time, that we're completely abandoning any semblance of common sense among the rest of the population. We're sort of jumping in and taking responsibility for the proper design of a driveway. It's not too steep, it's not too narrow, it's not too whatever. Please, don't you think that people who can muster the resources to purchase a piece of land have enough common sense also to either get consultants to advise them on the shortcomings or the detriments of the property?
Rolf, I want to take you for a ride around town.
I don't think that's the world we live in anymore, Rolf.
Yeah.
Well, but you're encouraging that. You get what I'm saying? The more you step in and say, we'll take care of this for you, we'll regulate it, the more you're letting people think that don't worry about it, somebody else will take care of it. I think this is a philosophical argument, but I would ask you to think about it.
I do. I do think about it all the time. How can we have people live what were formerly farmsteads and subdivide the property and be able to live on it and not be a burden to the other people?
Bruce, to further this argument, there's all this talk about protecting prime ag land.
I know.
You ever try to make a living farming? I've been there, done that, from the time I was a kid.
I know about the prime ag
So
land.
this is nonsense, it's ridiculous, it's absurd.
50 years ago.
As invoking all manner of protection for 10,000-year-old, very, very primitive, early human settlement.
It was not.
It is relatively meaningless in this day and age. I've been in countries where the history is much more connected, and I invite you, if you ever have the opportunity, to go to the museum, the National Museum of Archaeology in Mexico City. It is a classic example of how to exhibit this, but the work involved is monumental, and you need to weigh cost versus benefit at some point, no matter how fascinating or interesting it might be. Some things, time has passed by.
Yeah.
That you said that it wasn't, a guide, these are supposed to be guidelines. But I found some things that were a little bit, they kind of felt like an overreach to me, like the landscaping and screening, asking that you have trees along the subdivision roads to establish a canopy effect and maintain pedestrian scale. And it might, they may require a suitable hardwood shade trees. You're picking the kind of trees. They have to be 10 feet in height, 2 inches in diameter, measured at 0.6 inches. That seems awfully specific. And then the other one was, and going back to cost too, was that the Planning Commission shall require underground utilities in areas designated as important for scenic views in the aesthetic resources section of the town plan. And then it talks again about the trees and the canopy. I think, that's kind of an overreach when you're telling people they have to bury their lines when.
It's not forcing people.
People can't afford that.
Yeah, it's a recommendation. I mean, obviously, if it's a major or even a minor subdivision, the town isn't gonna make them bury the lines, unless if it's a huge subdivision. And it does cause an issue with visibility or aesthetics, it would be a recommendation.
But, so what happens because I know another one was sidewalks, which kind of made me laugh because we all know how our sidewalks are in our town.
Yeah.
So, yeah, what if they say, okay, thanks for the suggestion, no thanks.
You gonna approve it or not?
Approve
If they
what?
don't apply,
Well,
no.
No, the planning commission, yeah, it is a recommendation, but they can, they can enforce it. They could make it part of the permit. Absolutely, if it's a large subdivision, like.
So then it's on
20,
them
30
if
lots.
they can't afford it, they just
Well,
can't do it?
It would be with the development.
Well, it may not be, maybe it's Abe with his 6 plots of land.
Well, it could, yeah, you're right, like a board, not this board, obviously. You could have a board in the future that, yeah, they could be out of control. I doubt it, but.
Like your trees have to be, 6 feet to the angle of the sun and.
That's in there for, like a large subdivision that a developer's coming in. It could potentially change the character of the town. And we've had that happen.
Call Abe before he falls
But I think the problem is though that this has
Where?
to.
Carlton Road, there was a proposal for 600 units right before Irene, mixed-use development. That came in front of the select board. There was another one years ago, it didn't go very far, but there was going to be a new community up on Davis Road, I believe.
And the one up in that pond.
I don't remember that one.
That goes back into the wetlands
So
one,
are they-
buffer and all that, so we know we can have ponds in.
Are
So,
they
think
existing
about
or
them.
not?
No, they're not.
Okay.
Think about the Carlton Road development. They want to put 600 units on the north slope of Hawks Mountain.
So how far did that get? Let me ask you a question. How long did it take to kill that?
We didn't kill them.
We didn't.
They killed it themselves.
Well, exactly. Common sense took over for once.
But
Please.
that's not going to be every one though. We don't, you can't
But
predict that.
this subdivision bylaws have to be followed by those people as well as Abe.
Right.
So there's like no middle ground.
Well, it's up to, it would be up to
Yeah.
the planning commission. Like for a small subdivision, I doubt that they would make them.
I would hope that
That's
that
right.
was true.
That's right.
There is a waiver provision in there too, so, the applicant can say, hey, listen, this makes no sense in my situation. Please, let me not have to deal with that particular standard, so there would be that approach too.
I've done that when I was on the Development Review Board in Chester. That came up on a number of occasions where we said, we'd just be overly punishing to this, in this particular situation, and we'll vote to alter our requirements. We can do that.
Good, Abe.
My wife is going to love the fact that I'm the example of a low-budget developer. How do you do it on a shoestring and free piles? Can you request that the solar panels on the giant solar panel field are also put underground if you're going to do the professional cables? Right? If it's good for one power source, why not for another power source?
I don't know how to answer that.
Okay.
They won't work if they're underground.
Not as well, but again, buried utilities, and because the reality is a giant solar field is definitely a possibility in places. And so that would be a more concern than a few hundred housing units, quite frankly.
Yes, but the thing about solar fields are they're not necessarily permanent. They can be removed. And when the land underneath them becomes more valuable for another use, which is how land works, they could come out. Go ahead.
Okay, Maureen.
You next.
Let's
Yes.
say this goes through. I actually, this morning, I had 5 minutes. I went and looked at the statutes. So select board votes on it. It says that we have 20 days to submit a petition if we have X amount of signatures, that it can go to a popular vote. If we get there, this will go to a popular vote. Whether the select board votes on it or not, I will make sure of that.
I would hope so.
I would hope it would go to
And
a
I
popular
think
vote.
that it's the smartest thing to do in this town. I feel that it's an overreach. And if we're already having trouble regulating driveway permits, building permits that are already set, maybe those need to be adjusted, and maybe we need an arm to enforce those. Because right now, we don't have it. So we put this into place, who's gonna enforce it? The planning commission?
No.
Right?
No.
So I think it's a little cart before the horse here, and, to tell my daughter it's gonna cost her an additional $10,000 for a property that we're gonna give to her, for her to even break ground, is absurd.
Who's next then, Benny?
Yes.
So I'd just like to say, we came from Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia, and when, shortly after we got married, we bought a house in a development. There were 70 houses in the development. They had sidewalks going down both sides of the road. They had street lights. They put in maple trees, along the sidewalks. But as a father, when your kids are going to school, you like to know that they can walk down the sidewalk. So there's 70 homes there, so you have a lot of people going to work, as the kids walk down to the bus stop. So it's really comfortable to know that your kids are walking on the sidewalk and not walking down the street. So if I don't see developments coming here that have 70 houses. But if they were going to put something like that, there's really a big advantage to families to know that their kids are going to be secure being able to walk down the sidewalk. So I just, this is kind of what we had back in the 80s in Pennsylvania. So, I can see it's nice to have some of these requirements. You got to think hopefully young families are going to be here with kids walking up down the street, or mothers wanting to take their daughters, for a walk in a baby carriage.
I'd love to see that.
Yeah, that's.
If we want to save that building, we're going to have to.
Yeah.
Want to have a school, we're going to have to repopulate.
Okay. Any other comments?
Betty had.
Oh, Betty, yes.
It seems to me that a lot of this is solved by the state wastewater permit. If you're in the village and you have access to water and sewer, that's one thing. But any development or any building that takes place that doesn't have town water and town sewer, you've got to get your state wastewater permit. That wastewater permit takes into consideration isolation distances from your neighbor's well, from your well to your septic. So a lot of that is going to be limited by the slope of the land, by the quality of the soils. So it seems to me that a lot of this is solved by that wastewater permit. And could you require that any subdivision has the wastewater permit designed before it's allowed to take place, so we don't end up with either parcels that infringe on the neighbor or that are unbuildable? It just seems to me that that would be a common sense step to require, and that would solve a whole lot of these problems, because there'd be, there may be parcels that aren't buildable or aren't allowable because the slope is too steep.
Yeah.
Well, that is one of the first steps, getting your wastewater permit. It doesn't solve all of the issues with subdivisions, certainly a few of them that you mentioned, but it doesn't solve the issues of infrastructure like roads and drainage and things like that. Another thing too, we understand people's property rights and not having a lot of regulations. But they also go the other way. If you're a landowner and you have a subdivision that is abutting your property and say the drainage patterns all get changed and then your basement floods or your yard floods, which happens. I don't know where the equity in that is if you don't have any recourse. And a lot of times that's that's like their only investment is their land. So a lot of it is to protect abutting landowners.
This is weak language, but it does say that, the Planning Commission urges the applicant to get their state wastewater permits before, applying for the subdivision. So, it's not a requirement, but they are, encouraging that to happen.
But this is happening.
This lady has.
If we're having trouble with local permitting, how is that happening? We know it.
Here we'll go, Sam, you have a question or comment?
Well, yeah, all of this is words on paper if you don't have an enforcement arm.
Exactly.
We discovered personally that state of Vermont did not protect us at all, even though they had rules in place to protect us. There was no enforcement.
In what respect, Sam?
This was in regard to a quarry that was operating illegally across from our land over in Chester and Gassets. For 3 years, we had to fight this because the town of Chester wasn't doing anything, the state of Vermont wasn't doing anything, nobody was doing anything about this because they had no enforcement arm to Act 250. Now, finally, after a lot of cost to ourselves and our neighbors, and a lot of time spent doing Chester's job for them by getting all the evidence for them about what was going on.
Yeah, you actually live in Chester, don't you?
We live in Proctorsville now. We had to leave that land because of what was going on there.
I didn't realize you moved.
Yeah, we had to move because they weren't protecting us. They weren't protecting our neighbors. I could not take the noise anymore. It was causing mental and physical issues. And the state of Vermont had no enforcement. So anything that you do, anything that you pass, unless you have an enforcement arm, it's just words on paper. Sorry to say.
I will say that's true. Enforcement is really difficult, and a lot of the state programs aren't particularly enforced right now. For what it's worth, this includes an administrative officer position, and it's up to the select board to determine who that is. I think Rick would suggest it might be us, perhaps. But you would need somebody for that purpose, and that person would guide any applicant through the process as well as do enforcement. And it's not easy, and ultimately it comes down to the select board willing to pay legal fees to enforce things.
I will say the driveway issue is a problem, and we all know somebody who has more money than sense. And so people buy and build very expensive houses that are inaccessible by fire truck or very difficult to be accessed or can't be accessed in the winter, or the fire truck slides off them in the winter. It's a challenge, some of the places that people put houses to get emergency vehicles in. I don't know why the sheriff has to give a note, because if you can get a fire truck there, you can get a police car there, but maybe he's got a tank or something, I don't know. Go ahead, Diane.
Well, it's not individual owners buying lots and building houses. In the case of the Heald Road one, it's a developer doing a subdivision, putting in these steep driveways, and then people buy them. So it's not that somebody who has enough money to buy the property, design the driveway, they're buying it And not having spent a Vermont winter in town. So they're in for a surprise.
Okay. Anybody else?
It's really great to see people are interested in having a conversation and input, and I mean, that's what this evening is all about. And it's nice to set a standard that you like, that we like, that we can live by and not have to have the consequences of someone who is, you know, a bad, I don't know what word I'm trying to find, but it's, you know, common sense is part of the standard, I think, that we're trying to accomplish. And every one of these questions and comments, except for Abe's underground utilities and solar, we have come up on this board, and we've discussed it, and we've done pros and cons, and what if it's this, or what if it's that? That's what we've been doing for the last year and a half. And it's great that we have the community and we can continue the discussion. But it's also good to have a standard, or the lowest common denominator runs the course. So it's, I hope that you have some sort of a standard. You know?
And I urge everybody to come to our planning commission meetings.
Yeah.
I think we got some really good input tonight, and I'm assuming we'll probably make some changes. But please be involved, you know, whether you're for it or against it. We just want to have kind of a clear understanding so we can move forward. I remember years ago when zoning was proposed, there was such an outcry against it. I mean, the whole town, I think there was a petition. It's just that was it. It ended. But, you know, I think as a planning commission, we're sort of doing our job to at least entertain these subdivision regulations and propose them. Because I do think it will protect property owners. But I guess we can, does anybody have any other comments or questions? Sure.
I'm new to town. My name is Daniel Crosby. And so having gone through the process of acquiring property here and thinking of what's a small expense and a big expense, you know, if the typical house is $400,000 and you have to put, you know, 5% down, you can do that. And so that's $20,000. And if that's what you have, then anything that you're adding, whether it's, I heard somebody say 10,000, I don't know if it's a couple thousand, whatever these things add up. If you have $20,000 and a little bit more for property, 1,000 or 10,000 is a lot of money. So,
You know,
so my,
about a $400,000 house, but there's always significant exceptions to site work.
yeah, no, I understand all that. I'm just saying the significance of the amount of money that regulations cost and the imposition on the person who's buying it are meaningful, you know, and it just seems that for people to consider whether they're for it or against it, it would be useful to have a kind of some indication of what the cost would be when you're proposing a regulation to have a bottom line, and this would mean this to your bottom line. So that's my only observation here, especially when you're dividing it into many parcels and each one of those has to be surveyed, then each one of those is going to have a cost. And so I'm just saying what somebody says is not a big deal if you're just scraping by and trying to buy something in this environment. What somebody might consider a little is a lot to somebody else.
I want to say thank you all for working on this, although I'm not happy with all of it, and there's some of it that I think, you know, it's the burned edges that need to be cut off. I think there's some parts in here that are salvageable, and I appreciate the care and concern that you guys and the effort that you're putting in, because there are, like I said, there are problems, and I think even people who are absolutely dead set against it would say, no, there are some issues that need to be addressed, and I know that you guys are trying to do it, and so I appreciate that, and thank you.
Great, thank you. Oh, a couple quick announcements if we're all done. Green Up Day is on the 4th. It can be any time you want to do it. I don't know, Betty, do you want to add anything?
I'm not controlling going or organizing it this year. I did a couple of years ago, but it is one of my favorite days of the year. In the vestibule of the town office, there's a sign-up sheet. You can claim a portion of a road, put your name there so we know it's covered. Grab the green bags, take them to the transfer station. They're starting tomorrow, there'll be another sign-up sheet. The state of Vermont is shooting for a Guinness World Record with the number of people going out to clean up the state. So put your name on that list as well. And we all appreciate the roads that don't have iced tea containers on the side. So thanks for taking a portion.
Bud Light.
I would think Ellen Mulvaney cut down on the Bud Light as well.
Also too, there's a lot of COVID tests back there. Take all you want.
Yeah, if you have information for your refrigerator about where to go in an emergency, because we do flood, please pick one up for your refrigerator and to help you in your rain gardens. Think about a rain garden. This is the best manual for what to plant here in our town. And there are those presents out there.
And those COVID tests say they expire April 24, but they've been through October.
All right.
And there's about 5,000.